Federal politics saved perhaps its biggest surprise for one of the last weeks of the year with the surprise cabinet resignation of Chrystia Freeland. However, it's been an otherwise eventful year. What were the biggest stories, the biggest surprises, and who was the big winner in politics in 2024? I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post Parliamentary Bureau Chief Stuart Thomson and Parliamentary reporter Antoine Trepanier join me to break down the year that was. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. Antoine and Stuart, thanks again for joining me today. I know that we are going to talk about the year in review in Canadian politics, look back on some of the big stories of the year, but I'd be remiss if we didn't kind of dive into the news of the week first a little bit. There was big news out of Ottawa this week with the departure of one of Justin Trudeau's key cabinet ministers in Chrystia Freeland. She announced that she was resigning as finance minister on the eve of delivering a fall economic update. And Stuart, I'm just wondering if you can walk us through how that timeline worked and what Chrystia Freeland gave as her reasons for it, and I guess where the Trudeau government goes from here.
Yeah, well, to me, the timeline started on Monday morning when I was sitting in a big government building waiting for the government's fall economic statement, and it never came. It took 4 hours after the deadline when journalists were supposed to get it for us to actually receive it. And that is because that morning at 9:20, I saw a Slack message from my colleague Antoine Trepanier saying, Freeland resigned, all caps. And it was one of those things that you don't believe it when you first see it, because we were expecting to see her at a press conference that afternoon. And I think that is maybe a part of the story that was hard to communicate in news stories, is that this was a devastating thing for Freeland to do to the government on a lot of levels, but it also just totally screwed up that day. They had to figure out how to do a fall economic statement without a finance minister. It's not an easy thing to do. We came to learn, though, that the timeline started on Friday when Justin Trudeau got on a Zoom call with Chrystia Freeland and told her that he was going to be replacing her as finance minister. And she reacted in probably, as far as political maneuvering goes, a way that they just weren't expecting in the PMO. And now they're in just absolute damage control mode, trying to contain this. They already had problems with the rest of caucus, and now they have something of an avatar or a leader in Chrystia Freeland. We've spent the whole week calling Liberal MPs. Some of them are ready to jump. Some of them are telling Trudeau, maybe it's time to go. Some are saying he has to reflect. But right now, I think we've had a few crises for Justin Trudeau as far as his leadership of the Liberal Party goes. But this is, I think, by far the hardest one he's faced.
Now, this is like an issue that the government has tried to downplay for a while, like the discontent or the fractured relationship between Justin Trudeau and his finance minister. Do we get a sense of why it finally came to a head, that Trudeau was looking to get rid of her, or even that she, would scoop him on that and step away at probably the most inopportune time?
Yeah, there's been reporting that Mark Carney was supposed to come in, and I think if you can get someone like that, you would do it. I don't know how solid that reporting is. I don't know how sure Mark Carney was that he was going to come in as finance minister. And I think what you have to look at is last spring, in the spring budget, we had a capital gains tax hike that seemed to show some divides between finance and PMO as to what their priorities were. There was, I think, since then, on a lesser level before that, they just haven't been on the same page. They've had different ideas of what's the best course for the country. In her letter that she posted on Twitter on Monday for her resignation, Chrystia Freeland referred to these as political gimmicks. She was tired of political gimmicks in budgets, in fall economic statements. And I think that was a reference to things like the GST holiday the government just brought in, that even from polling that we did was kind of widely seen by Canadians as a gimmick, something that wasn't a serious policy. So I think there's a lot of personal political maneuvering going on here. This has clearly put Chrystia Freeland in frontrunner status to replace Justin Trudeau. But I do think there was actual strife going back and forth there. So it isn't totally inorganic either.
Hmm. Well, I think that might get us a little caught up. I know there's the fallout from this is going to reverberate for quite a while, and it may even come up as part of our conversation looking back on the year in Canadian politics. But to make kind of a hard turn or a bad segue, we should jump back a little bit. I do want to talk to both of you about the year that was in Canadian politics. And Antoine, I'll probably start with you. We'll jump back to Stuart in a second. When looking at the year in Ottawa and the troubles that the Prime Minister has had, the Liberal Party has had, the ascendant Conservative Party, is there a story for you that kind of rings out as the big story of the year? And is it perhaps overtaken by the news of this week?
Well, actually, a year ago to the day, actually, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was giving year-end interviews to a bunch of reporters, and the main question was, "Will you stay or will you go?" And the entire year, this question remained. Uh, Probably 1,000 times he had to answer that question, and so every decision he made, there was always in the backdrop a little bit of that question: will he leave? Is he a lame duck here? And so it was at the beginning of the year, of course, the conservatives were very strong in the polls, but it's really in June that you saw the Liberals in in a limbo, actually, when you had the by-election in Toronto St. Paul's, a safe seat, one of the safest for the Liberals, and they lost it. They lost it to the Conservative, and I think the tailspin started there. There was another blow in La Salle-Mort Verdun in Montreal, and so, where the Bloc Québécois won against the Liberals, and it was a safe seat for the Liberals. It was the former seat of actually Prime Minister Paul Martin at some point, and former Attorney General David Lametti. So I think the story of the year here is, yeah, Trudeau is still here, and they lost a lot, and safe seats.
And Stuart, what about for you? As someone who's really got an eye on federal politics, as the bureau chief there, was there anything that really stood out for you? Was it the by-election losses? Do you agree with Antoine? Was it the foreign interference scandal that didn't seem to want to go away? Was there something else for you that kind of rose above all the others?
Yeah, there are two sides of this coin. So the liberal strife, the other side of that is the conservative gains. And I do remember at the beginning of this year, people wondering, have they peaked too soon? Has Pierre Poilievre gotten too high in the polls too fast? And how do you maintain that? And actually, that's not the question I think we ever asked ourselves this year, because they just kept rising. Even now, they're getting up to numbers. They were +2 in an Abacus poll just the other day. And the fact that they can still be plus once they're in the 40s is something that even the most optimistic conservatives wouldn't have seen that coming. And I think that is, whether you take it as a story of liberal strife or a story of Pierre Poilievre's success, I think they're both sides of the same coin. And then I would also add the sort of general political story has to include the NDP, which, with a Liberal Party hemorrhaging support, they are not picking up any of it. And I just don't get it. They are supposed to be the progressive alternative. You would think that they would want to be. I know they have some trouble with money in the bank, so they probably don't want an election anytime soon. But is there ever going to be a better opportunity than now? And I think what's happening is we've seen this anger against incumbents all over the world. The Liberals are obviously getting some of that. And I think actually because the NDP were governing with the Liberals, I think they're getting some of that ire. And the question of whether or not they can shake that off and look more like an opposition party than a junior partner in a government, I think that is the tough question for Jagmeet Singh. And I think that'll be a big story of 2025. But I think the steadiness of the political setup in 2024 was kind of the big story, that nothing really changed except that things just kept getting worse for Trudeau and they kept getting better for Poilievre.
Now, in the news business, we all love to be surprised by things. I'm sure that despite it throwing your day out of whack, Monday's news was kind of brought some energy to your week, a nice way to start the week with a big political surprise. Looking back on the last 12 months, Stuart, was there a story that kind of caught you by surprise, that kind of came out of nowhere that you didn't anticipate coming?
Yeah, so you are right that we've been living on pure adrenaline this week. It's this is it is like you try not to be too obvious about that as a journalist, but you do kind of live for the news, and sometimes the news is messy. But I would say Antoine kind of mentioned this earlier, but I am just surprised at the story we didn't get, which is that Justin Trudeau has stayed on as Liberal leader, and I'm also surprised at how little movement there has been in the Liberal Party. I think we'll probably see things start to move now that Freeland is gone. I think that has sort of unblocked the dam a little bit. But Toronto St. Paul, that's a devastating election loss. LaSalle in Montreal, the Liberals are losing seats in Montreal, and nobody seemed to want to do anything about it. And I think that has been probably the most surprising thing about this year is that we didn't get to write that story. And I think that's partly Trudeau's personality. He's a confident guy, and actually, I think he thrives when people doubt him, and that's a good thing to have in you. But at some point, people are doubting you for totally rational reasons. It's just like it's no longer a sign that you're going to come back from the dead. So I think that his almost unique personality is part of that, but also that all of these Liberal MPs, all of these cabinet ministers basically owe their careers to Justin Trudeau. And I think that loyalty and the sort of the personal relationships in that party are perhaps a bigger part of the story than we realized in June when we were looking at this through the lens of just pure politics. So this may change soon, but I am surprised Trudeau's still around.
Yeah, it has been the one thing that, after the by-election losses and then after some of these other scandals or issues that have come up, I am kind of surprised that he has still hung on. I guess maybe he still thinks that he is the best person and or has the best shot against Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives in the next election. Antoine, what about for you? Was it the by-elections that really kind of caught you by surprise? These losses in Montreal, or was there another story that popped up that just made you kind of turn your head and think, "Oh, I didn't anticipate that."
Yeah, well, of course, these were surprise and they were significant. But to make maybe keep on Stuart's point here, Trudeau is still here, but the people around him, they're falling apart. We had 9 ministers in 2024 that either said they won't reoffer in the next election, or they were fired, or they resigned. And so this is a lot of people. It's almost a third of the cabinet. And last year in 2023, the Liberals were saying, we are making a shuffle, a cabinet shuffle in the middle of the summer, because this is going to be the team that we will present to Canadians in the next election. And so at the time, they asked all the cabinet ministers, will you be a candidate in the next election? And so the people that were sworn in at the time, well, you had the feeling that they were candidates in the next election. Well, it's no longer the case. You had Pablo Rodriguez that left the Liberal ship in September to run for the Liberals, the Quebec Liberal leadership. And then you had Seamus O'Regan, a close ally to Justin Trudeau, who in the spring resigned for personal reason. And now you have 3 cabinet ministers with multiple files, with Dominic LeBlanc being the finance minister, but also public safety and intergovernmental affairs minister. It's incredible what's going on right now. Justin Trudeau is still there, but around him, everything changed.
We'll be right back. Now, on the other side of that, we've had big stories, we've had surprising stories. And when I look back at the year in politics, I do think of the by-election losses. I do think of the ascendancy of the Conservative Party and how Pierre Poilievre has done, I think, a lot of work trying to paint himself as the most credible alternative to the Prime Minister and to the Liberal Party. I think about the foreign interference inquiry. I think about even the Online Harms Act and some. So those are some of the big headlines. But for both of you, I'll start with you, Antoine. Was there a story that flew under the radar for you that perhaps Canadians should be paying closer eye to?
Yes, actually in July, my colleague Christopher Nardi uncovered something very weird that's going on at the Supreme Court of Canada, where the building is magnificent, as you probably know, and in the main hall, you have the grand entrance hall that we call. There's a bunch of busts, busts of former chief justices. When they leave the court, you have private donors that will pay thousands of dollars to have the bust of a former chief justice. But right now, at the Supreme Court, you have Richard Wagner's bust,
Yeah.
and he's still sitting as the chief justice. And the story that Chris uncovered in the summer was that we don't know who paid for it. It's anonymous. And, we understand that it's not the government. It's the Supreme Court of Justice. It's the judicial system. We understand that, but there's a lack of transparency here. We don't know who gave the money to have this bust. And I think that it should have made more headlines across this country, because it's quite telling that we don't know if there's a conflict of interest somewhere here. And yeah, I think it flew under the radar, but we should bring it back in 2025.
Stuart, what about for you? Was there a story that maybe kind of simmered a little too much below the surface that perhaps Canadians didn't pay a lot of attention to that they should have in mind?
Yeah, I think it is wild that Antoine and myself and everybody else in this bureau spent the last 3 months covering Parliament Hill, and they didn't do a single thing. The government, there was no new
Yeah.
bills. There was QP and there was committees, but there was no new business at the House because it's entirely tied up by debate over a privilege motion about documents related to what the Conservatives call the Green Slush Fund. And however you feel about the privilege motion, liberals will say that it's absurd and they've given up what they can and it's a silly way to give documents. Conservatives and the speaker, who agrees with them, would say the government owes documents when the House demands them. But they're still debating this. They've been debating this for 3 months. The order of precedence in the House is that you need to finish the privilege debate or adjourn it before you can do anything else. We had a couple of minor adjournments. One was for the GST holiday to pass and for a couple of opposition days. That's about it. And I think that is one of the strangest things to have flown under the radar, that all the parties seem content with this. The Liberals, I don't think, want to be introducing new bills. I think they want to get into election readiness mode,
Mm-hmm.
which is more about vibes than legislation. And I think the Conservatives are happy to rail on the Liberals for not doing anything, but also for them, they expect to be governing next year, and I think they'd prefer they don't have to undo any more Liberal programs.
Yeah, that is an interesting predicament for the Conservatives to be in, if they don't want to have to undo a bunch of new liberal legislation to just kind of ride it out. But I suppose it gives them a cudgel with which to hit the Liberals on a daily basis for not getting anything done. Now, I do want to combine the next two questions as they are both sides of one coin. Looking at the year, and perhaps the answers are obvious. I know that Pierre Poilievre was named the Canadian Press Newsmaker of the Year, voted on by editors across the country, and so when you're looking at the year in politics and who had a good year, who had a bad year, and I suppose in this case, who had the best year and who had the worst year, Stuart, who would you categorize as having had that kind of year? Whether it's Poilievre was the best, Trudeau is the worst, or are there other people in there who might factor in?
Yeah, I thought really hard about getting cute with this one and trying to do something a little more surprising than the obvious answers, but I think that's actually just the wrong instinct, because it is so inarguable that it's Poilievre. He's had an incredible year, and he's in that mode now where he can almost do nothing wrong, because they have such a polling buffer that they can try things, they can throw policies out there, they can test things in a way that you can't when you're in razor thin margins in the polls, and they just have this like almost unprecedented moment in Canadian history. I actually don't think that they're using it as much as they could because they're running such a tight, risk averse ship there that if you talk to some of these people in OLO or some of the conservative MPs, they've been running it as a campaign basically since Polyev came in as leader. And that is exhausting. And they're being risk averse in the sense that they just use their slogans. They have the four things they want to hammer away at. And because it's worked so well, they're actually scared to do anything else. And the MPs don't get to talk. They don't get to say anything. Polyev is extremely small c conservative, temperamentally conservative about what he talks about. And they've just limited themselves to a few different issues. And I think actually you saw the downside of that when Trump first came in and threatened the tariffs. They looked a little skittish. They didn't quite know how they could get, axe to tax into a statement about Trump's tariffs. And I think that is maybe the thing they'll have to worry about next year when the election gets closer and people start taking a more serious look. But we're certainly not there yet. And just inarguably great year for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives.
Antoine, what about for you? Is it a case of Poilievre kind of had the standout year? Is there another politician who you think really fared well? And is there a politician who really fell to depths that no politician wants to hit?
I'm going to be a contrarian here. I will say, actually, for me, the most successful politician must be Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon in Quebec. It's provincially, yes, but it has echoes federally. Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon is the leader of the Parti québécois. He won only 3 seats in the last provincial election 2 years ago, but right now he's leading all the polls in Quebec. And he's giving a lot of power to Yves-François Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc québécois. And there are a lot of requests made by the provincial government in Quebec that there are ideas from the Parti québécois. And so he has some power in the fact that right now we talk more and more about separatism. And as you know, a decade ago, even 2 years ago, it wasn't even on the radar. And right now, there are more and more stories about the fact that the Parti québécois, if they win the next provincial election, well, there's going to be a referendum. They promised it. They doubled down on it. And by 2030, there could be a referendum on Quebec sovereignty. And so this will impact the entire country. It is important. It is significant. And so to me, just the fact that we're talking about this today, and we've been talking about this for many months in Ottawa as well, I think I think I will give him this title. But to answer your other question, who had a bad year? I will say, and I'm sorry to them, but the liberal mutineer, the liberals putschers that we were calling, they wanted the king's head. They didn't have it. They tried to push Justin Trudeau out in the fall. It wasn't successful. They were not really organized. These were about 2 dozens of MPs, liberal MPs, that wanted to push the prime minister out of his job. Didn't work. I just feel that if you want to go for the king, be prepared. Be prepared. Don't miss him. And they really did the first time. Will they succeed this time? Really, I don't know, but I don't have high hopes for them.
And Antoine, they came at the king with a reply all email in July, and I don't think that's how you get things done.
As you know, they didn't learn the lesson from Omar on The Wire. You come at the king, you best not miss. And lastly, looking ahead into 2025, I guess I'll kind of combine my last 2 questions into one. And Antoine, we'll start with you and we'll give you the last word, Stuart. Looking into 2025, is there a person that that you have your eye on, or a story that you have your eye on? I know like Justin Trudeau and his future and the federal election are obviously kind of easy pickings there, but I'm curious, is that what you're mainly focused on, or is there another story there for you, Antoine, that you have your eye on in 2025?
To me, it's really the next election. Pierre Poilievre, will he become the next Canada's next prime minister? According to pretty much all polls, it is the case, and we're talking about a strong, very strong majority right now. And so, to me, what I will look, what is important to me is who's going to be the official opposition. How much the Liberal will lose in that election. And Yves-François Blanchet, will he become the next leader of the official opposition? It's a possibility. And I think in 2025, this is the radar. This is the story. This is everything comes back to this. I know we're going to talk a lot about the tariffs. We're going to talk about CUSMA, the next, the negotiations around that, the relationship with Trump. But to me, it all comes down to the federal election. And we could have two federal parties without a leader after that election: the Liberals on one side and the NDP on the other, if they're not successful and if they don't win seats that are Liberals right now. So I think it's a little boring. I'm sorry, but I really feel that it's Canadians really, really need to pay attention to that election.
Yeah. Stuart, is it the same for you? Is it just kind of we're into election mode now? This is going to be the big story. The Trump tariffs may be an issue, but it all kind of comes down to how Canadians wind up voting in October, or I guess at any point in between, if they can bring down the government in advance.
Yeah, I think all these things are related, but I do think the Trump tariffs are going to be an earthquake in January. And what we're seeing this week is, with the Liberal strife creating a kind of a vacuum on the federal level, Doug Ford is on Fox News and he's talking to people in the U.S. and he's becoming almost a quasi foreign minister at this point. So I think all that does tie in together, but someone to watch out for, I think, Conservative MP Jamil Jivani. Some of your listeners may know, best buddies with Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. They went to Yale Law School together. Jivani has been down there twice. He had lunch with his buddy after the election, and they really are actually friends. It's not something that's being kind of puffed up for PR. J.D. Vance mentioned Jivani in his book, Hillbilly Elegy. So I don't know if the Conservatives quite know how to use that yet, because they're desperately afraid of being tied to Trump. And I think what they want to be is Pierre Poilievre, the fighter for Canada against Trump. So having a guy on the inside of Trump world, I don't think is, to them, a slam dunk strategic win. But he is certainly, for a journalist, an interesting character and someone worth watching if they're doing any kind of diplomacy on this. So that's the story to me and the person. Watch out for Jivani and these tariffs when they come down January 20th, maybe January 21st, depending on how quickly Trump can write them up. It's going to be huge. And I think it could scramble the political discourse in this country. It's going to change, I think, the way we talk about the political situation, but it may not change who's in front. I think Canadians have shown through polling that they like the idea of Pierre Poilievre to stand up to Trump. And I think that'll probably continue as these tariffs come down.
Excellent. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, guys. Just want to say thanks very much for your time. All the best to you and yours in the new year.
Thanks, Dave.
You too, Dave.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guests, Stuart Thomson and Antoine Trepanier. You can find more from them at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.